Welcome to Women of the Military podcast. This is week 4 of the Girls Guide to the Military series, sponsored by Women Veteran Alliance. This week is all about basic training. I'm sharing 5 tips for basic training, and these are things that I wish I would have known before heading off to my basic training, along with how some things have changed in the past few years. Basic training is meant to be tough. The military is working to break you down and then build you back up into who they want you to be as an airman, soldier, marine, sailor, guardian, or Coast Guardsman. And along with the tips that I'm giving, I also interviewed Allison, who had just completed basic training when we did her interview, and so she had a really fresh perspective of what it was like to go through basic, tips that she learned and wanted to pass on to you. So I'm really excited about this week's episode, so let's hear from this week's sponsors and then we'll get started. Thank you to our title sponsor, Women Veteran Alliance. Women Veteran Alliance is the premier national network focused on directly impacting the quality of life of women veterans. They do this successfully through transforming the way the community networks bring people and programs directly together. Women Veteran Alliance provides weekly webinars, conferences, scholarships for veteran businesses, and more. Check out their membership options and learn how you can be involved in connecting with women veterans by heading over to their website at www.womenveteransalliance.org. But besides connecting women veterans, Women Veteran Alliance does so much more. Every other year in the fall, Women Veteran Alliance hosts their unconference with the goal of bringing women veterans together. I attended in 2021 and I had so much fun connecting with other women veterans, and I can't wait until September of 2023 for the next one in Las Vegas. If you would like to learn more about the conference, head down to the show notes for a direct link. You can also find more about the unconference at www.womenveteranalliance.org. Women of the Military would also like to thank our sponsor, Volbreck Consulting. Volbreck Consulting is owned and operated by Marine Corps veteran Jennifer Volbreck. Volbreck Consulting is a premier project management and project controls company who partners with government agencies to deliver energy and technology projects to support defense and science missions. They do this work with a unique focus on leadership and people-first mentality, which supports a positive work environment. Being veteran-owned and operated, Volbreck Consulting invests in hiring veterans and working with transitioning service members as they exit the military. Learn more at www.jvc-inc.com. That's jvc-inc.com, and there'll be a link in the show notes as well. So the first tip is to know basic training is a game. I love what Air Force veteran Dr. Angela Carnes Pardon said, "Everything in the beginning is to see if they can break you. Everything in the back half is to build you back up. You'll chip away perhaps, but you won't break. When it starts to feel easier, then you will know that you've made it to the building up phase and past the trying to break you phase." I loved her quote because it really explains what the process of basic training is like. And part of that process is basic training is meant to break you down. And knowing this can help make it a little bit easier to go through basic training. It's nice to know that you won't be able to do everything right, and even if you do everything right, the instructors will find something, because that's part of the process of like always trying to push you and to find things and to make you malleable so that they can mold you into who they want you to be. And it's also great to know that it's part of the process, because on the days that you want to quit, you can remember that it's just part of the process, and each day will get a little bit easier and you'll learn a little bit more, and that you can do it. You just have to do it one day at a time. And so sometimes it can feel overwhelming to think that my life is going to be like this for the next 6 weeks, but each day changes, each part of the process changes, and you get to grow and become stronger through it. The last thing I want to say about the game of boot camp is another quote, this time from Navy veteran Lisa Rylage, and she said, "Don't take correction as a statement about your intrinsic value as a person. Use each new day as a new chance to be better." My second tip for basic training is to be physically ready. Basic training is physical. Besides the additional exercise required throughout the training, just the aspect of marching from place to place, going through the various obstacle courses or other challenges, and also being on your feet all day long can be physically draining. Being at a moderate or above average fitness level can help make the training less challenging. But just know the stronger you are, the harder you'll be pushed. So it won't ever be easy per se, no matter how in shape you are, but it is less physically draining to be in shape. And another great thing about being at a moderate fitness level is it also can help prevent injuries, especially shin splints. So it's great to start working out and getting ready for your training the moment that you find out that you're going to join the military, because sometimes they send you off to training really quickly and you don't have a lot of time to prepare. Another thing about physical fitness, which we'll dive into later in the series, is preparing for your branch's physical fitness test. Each branch has their own unique physical fitness test, and while it used to be primarily push-ups, sit-ups, and running, and maybe pull-ups, the Army has recently come out with their Army Combat Fitness Test, which has a lot more physicality to it and not so basic things as push-ups and sit-ups and running. And the Air Force is also making changes of what is required, and so is the Space Force. So there's a lot of different changes. Things are always changing in the military, and so it's important that you do your research and find out as much as you can about what the physical fitness test requirements are so that you can be ready to pass the test at the end of your training. The third tip for basic training is to know the standards. The military has undergone a lot of change in the last few years. Some changes are widespread, other things haven't trickled down to basic training. For example, later when I talked to Allison, the military hair standards had been changed before she went, but she still had to have her hair in a bun and had to keep it into the same standards that were there before the change was made. So it was kind of dependent on who was in charge, what the rule was for the trainees, and so it's important to understand what requirements may or may not be in place and just be prepared for it and know that's something that you might have to face. And another thing that I think has been a really big change is how the use of cell phones has been allowed. And Allison talked about that on Sundays for a few hours she would get her cell phone and she would have free time to make phone calls, check email, go on social media. And that's something that's drastically different than what I had heard from years before, where you didn't get your phone at all. When I went to my training, we put our phones in bags the first day, and then we saw them the last day before we were going to go home in the morning, but we were told that we were not allowed to turn them on or use them until we were at the airport the next day. So I think communication is changing because of the advent of cell phones, and it's dependent on your leadership on what privileges will be allowed. So make sure that you're prepared to have the addresses of if you want to send letters home, but also know that that might be an option and just be prepared for that. And also know that any privilege that they give you during basic training can be taken away. So nothing's guaranteed, but it's good to know what may or may not be and how the military is changing. My fourth tip for basic training is to be prepared. Know everything you can about the branch you are joining. There's no way to learn everything about the branch because some things are just learned by doing, but one of the best things that I think you can learn before you arrive at your training is to learn the different ranks, what they look like, what they're called, and especially the difference between officer and enlisted ranks, because then you'll know those in the beginning and you won't have to learn them. Another great thing to know before you arrive is your branch's creed, core value, and song. Those will be things that you're required to memorize while you're at training, and if you already have them memorized, it can help you not have to worry about memorizing those things while you're there and just give you extra confidence as you go through your training. Another thing that is helpful to learn is military time. The military uses a 24-hour clock so that there isn't confusion about when to meet. Instead of saying 3 p.m., the military says 1500 hours. It's really easy to learn. You just, after 12 p.m., you add how many hours are to 12 and you can figure it out. But it is kind of tricky to learn in the beginning because I always found myself having to do that, go to 12 at a time and figure out what actual time it was. But eventually it becomes second nature and pretty easy to use. Another thing I saw when I was doing research for this episode is that people recommended learning the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is a 6-article statement that apply to all military members and can be used to rely on if you are captured during war. All military members learn the Code of Conduct during their training, and I put a link in the show notes so that you can learn the whole thing. I learned the Code of Conduct before I went to my training, and it is something that we were required to memorize, all 6 articles. And so learning as much as you can before you go can make it easier to help you be ready and to take the limited time that you have to review it instead of learning it from scratch. So those are great things to learn, and then you can do more research as much or as little as you want, but those are great things to know, and your recruiter will also probably give you some advice on things that you should know before you go to basic training, so use them as a resource as well. My last tip, which is tip 5, is don't give up. You can do it. Don't ever forget that you can do this training. You can keep putting one foot in front of the other, and all you have to do is not quit. Rely on the team members that you've met around you. Make friends with other women that you meet. Know that everyone is struggling in one way or another. It may look like everyone's doing great and there's no struggle, but we all struggle in different ways, and it can sometimes feel lonely and isolating if you feel like you're struggling and no one else is. But open up and talk to other people and find out how they're doing. And then if you see someone who's struggling, try and help them out and help them through the struggle that they're facing, because maybe they can help you out in a different way. Basic training is the first step in your journey to the military, and you should use the time to grow and push yourself to be all that you can be. That's so cliche. But you can do more than you think you can, and you can get through this training. It's just one step into your future. So those are my 5 tips. They're kind of short, but in my book, A Girl's Guide to Military Service, which is coming out in September, I have 2 whole chapters dedicated to basic training, and it goes a lot deeper into advice and more tips to help you through. And so if you're interested, you can pre-order that, and the link for that is in the show notes. And now we're going to talk to Allison, who I interviewed right after she finished her basic training. So she'll have more tips and advice, and it'll be interesting for you to hear her experience of what it was like to go through basic training. And then next week, we're going to focus on officers. And Allison, after she finished basic training, she went to officer training school with the Army. And so I have another interview with her and also an interview with an ROTC cadet. And all of this basic training advice could be applied to the officer training you go to. So these are things I wish I would have known when I was going to my officer training. Some of the things I already knew because I had been an ROTC for 2 years, but this is great advice for anyone who's going to a military training just to help you be ready and prepared. So now let's dive into Allison's interview, and I'll see you guys next week. Welcome to the show, Allison, and I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you just got home from boot camp with the Army.
Yeah.
And you're in the in-between stage of waiting to go to OTS. So we're going to talk about preparing to go to boot camp and then what boot camp was like. And then we're going to do a follow-up episode after you get back home from OTS. But let's start with, why did you decide to join the military?
So it's something that I always really wanted to do. I know it sounds really cheesy saying like I had a call to serve, but I mean, something that I was always really passionate about and something that I always wanted to pursue along the way, but life, I guess, kind of got in the way, because my plan originally was to go to either an academy or ROTC. But, you know, the way things happened, I ended up getting a degree without doing any military service at all. And so when I graduated with my degree this past May, I had made the decision previously, because it took a lot of paperwork to get to where I was, but I made the decision to join post-grad. And so ended up kind of starting seemingly like middle of the road compared to some of the other people that I was there with who are fresh out of high school, making the same decision that I am in order to go to college or things like that, you know?
I think we met before you graduated, and your degree is civil engineering, right?
Yes, it is.
And I wasn't able to convince you to join the Air Force, which I think is funny. So why did you end up going with the Army instead of the Air Force? If you guys are listening, I'm an Air Force civil engineer is like my degree. So I really pushed hard for it.
You did push hard. I also got like quasi recruited with the Navy too. They were pushing for the Seabees. But I think what drew me to the Army the most was both my grandfathers were drafted and served in the Army for Korean War and I think the Vietnam War. They were stateside most of the time, but they were in the Army. And that's, the legacy of that is something that I appreciated. And also in my research, I was looking for something that was a balance between like super hua and super, with my degree. And for me, it felt like from my research that the Army would be the best fit for the things that I was looking to get out of my military experience.
Yeah, I love that you did all that research and that you looked at all the different options and then you picked the best thing for you.
Yeah, and I think like just with my personality, but from listening to your show and all the people that I've talked to, it's all about like doing your own research and really picking apart stories and other people's experiences to a degree, but just figuring out what's going to work best for you and your situation and what you're looking for out of your experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. About a week or two before you went to boot camp, we ended up chatting because I was looking for information and you were generous with your time and talked to me. In that conversation, we were talking a lot about two things that I remember were you were worried about passing the ACFT, the Army Combat Fitness Test, and you also were worried about your weight, which put you in such a hard situation. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So one thing that I found I was struggling with was building up the muscular strength to, meet the standards of the new fitness test while also not putting on too much muscle that I supersede the height and weight requirements of the Army, which are, arguably outdated, but whatever. So when I initially went to MEPS in May before my ship date, I was within the standard of the height and weight requirements. And I found out that my ship date was going to be in October. So I had the summer to train and I trained hard. I was doing 2-a-days. I was running a ton and lifting a ton because a lot of the new fitness test is very strength based. They've got like the deadlift and a lot of heavy lifting and pulls and all things like that. So those were things that I was trying to develop, especially as a female. It's hard with like pull up strength for the leg tuck and stuff. And I found that by the time the end of the summer came and it was, 5 or 6 weeks before my ship date, I was 5 pounds over my weight requirement for MEPS. And my recruiters were like, hey, it's 5 pounds, but they're not going to ship you if you're over any weight. And I was very nervous about not making the weight requirement and not ultimately shipping out. So yeah, struggling with that and then finding that balance of training to meet the standard for fitness, but also meet the standard for the height and weight. It felt like I was being pulled in two different directions by the Army to meet both of those standards. I don't know. Luckily, we made it through, so it was fine.
Yeah, I remember we were talking about it, and didn't you have a coach who helped you with losing the weight?
Yeah, so I actually got connected with a nutritionist who was an ex-Marine, and she had told me about, the diet culture of the military, especially around weigh-ins, can be really toxic. And she wanted to make sure that I didn't go down a path that was super toxic as it tends to. So she gave me all this advice about fueling for performance and making sure that I'm prioritizing, these food groups to fuel for muscular improvement, but also while maintaining like the body composition changes that we were hoping for and things like that. Because at the end of the day, like muscle always does way more than fat, and finding that balance of fueling to improve as an athlete, but also, managing your weight for the height and weight standards long term are things that, to this day, I think a lot of us still struggle with. So, but she was incredibly helpful and I was very lucky to run into her.
Yeah, and I remember I felt like that was one of the things you were the most worried about was just getting to go to training because you were worried about being overweight. Then a secondary thing was the physical fitness aspect because you kind of had to cut back on how much you were working out, especially with the strength training. So how did that work out?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest concern was a lot of the physical elements, both because of having to, really cut down on calories, especially the last couple of weeks, but also because I was worried about. I had a lot of medical paperwork that I had to process because I had reconstructive hip surgery right before I ended up going. And I got all the paperwork approved, and that's a whole another story of MEPS. But the combination of pushing myself to train so that I made sure nothing happened with any, previous injury or future injury, but also managing fueling and eating for performance, I was nervous, but it ended up not being an issue because as soon as I got there, once I got through the weigh-in, I focused on fueling for performance and fueling for working out and maintaining the level of caloric intake that was needed, especially in those first couple of weeks of basic training. And it really wasn't an issue. The tools that she gave me enabled me to fuel for performance effectively in a way that wasn't super detrimental to my athletic abilities, especially initially.
It's great to hear. And what was her name? Did you say it already?
Her name was Angeli Mora.
Okay. And did she have a website?
Yeah, I think she's with Metro West Nutrition. They're out of Boston, which is where I shipped out of.
So I'll link to her info in the show notes so that if people want to find it, they can. And then let's just talk about basic training. Before we started this interview, you said there were some things that you felt prepared for and then other things that you didn't. So what do you feel like you were prepared for when you arrived at basic?
Well, one thing that I definitely felt prepared for because I did so much research was feeling really squared away with a lot of initial memorization things that, the Army requires you to know. So like the soldier's creed, the warrior ethos, the phonetic alphabet, military time, things like that. We spent a lot of time, staring at a piece of paper, and they were like, memorize everything on this piece of paper. And it was like a cheat sheet of all the things that you need to know just to be at that base level for understanding the military. And going in with that knowledge of having, committed a lot of things to memory, it made it a lot easier, especially for me, because it was one level of stress that I was able to take off. I wasn't scrambling to memorize the Army song or the general orders right off the bat. So I felt super prepared for things like that, which was a relief. I also really went out of my way to train physically, as we mentioned before, for the ACFT. Because I know that the Army's been going back and forth on it a lot, but it is, the fitness test of record right now. And one thing is that as a personal goal, I wanted to be able to do leg tucks because I know that they have the alternative still with the plank. But when I got there at basic training, the plank alternative was not an option to graduate. You had to either be able to do a leg tuck or a 10-second hang from the bar. And those were the two alternatives to graduate and pass the ACFT. And so I know a lot of people who, when I was talking to them or through the process, was like, oh, I'll just get in shape for basic training at basic training, right? I'll just go there and they'll get me in shape. And I felt like preparing for that fitness test, especially beforehand, went a really long way for me being able to improve physically rather than just get a beat down, because I feel like basic training often is just more of a beat down than it is exercise and improvement of fitness. It's just how long can you go kind of thing. And a lot of the females were able to get the leg tuck by the end of basic training, but a lot didn't. And so the females especially, it's just a lot harder on us, the leg tuck especially.
I've done a good amount of research about the new fitness tests, and there are a lot of studies and research out there that it is more challenging for women who are doing it than for men. And it also, the weight thing is a thing where you're trying to build up all that muscle mass and stuff. But it sounds like you said two things that really helped you is you memorized as much stuff as you could about the military and the Army before you went. And so then you didn't have to memorize it while you were there. And then you also, I always try and tell people, like, you need like a basic level of fitness because you don't want to get injured. You don't want to
Exactly.
have
You don't want to
to
get
be.
recycled.
Yeah, and so if you have that base level of fitness, you're less likely to get injured. You're less likely just to have other ailments, and you'll be able to build on that foundation. So those are two really good pieces of advice.
Absolutely.
Was there anything else that you felt prepared for?
In my research, I mean, it's kind of crazy how much information you can find out there, but there is so much out there on, down to the day what you do at basic training. And, YouTube videos, blogs, schedules, like doing all that research for me and having, because I'm a bit of a planner, so I like to know what's coming and having that idea of like, okay, in red phase, we're going to be doing these things. In white phase, it's, a lot more marksmanship. So you're doing a lot of range days. And, in blue phase, it's this and that. And having that understanding of how the weeks were generally going to shake out prior to going there, it took away some of that element of, at least for me, stress, because a lot of the time, they always say all you really need to know is right place, right time, right uniform. But having the understanding of generally what you're going to be doing, for me at least, helped me get in the right mindset for a lot of it. Because I'm the people around me were always like, why are we doing this? This is so frustrating. There's no point in doing this, that, and the other thing. And like having that understanding, at least for me, of like why we're doing this way, this time, and in this manner, and just knowing what was coming next kind of, for me, helped me through the process and helped me manage that, stress that they try to induce in you and power through kind of thing.
Yeah, and when I was in Army training for my deployment and they made us do stuff, I was always like, why are we doing this dumb thing? But there always was a reason and a process, and they don't explain it even when you're on active duty. They're like, just do it.
Right.
But they definitely don't explain it at boot camp. But yeah, there is a reason and a process and like why they've done it. And the more research you do, I think that's good to be prepared to know what's coming and what's going on. That probably really does help. But even with all your research, you said that there were some things that you weren't prepared for. What were the things that you weren't prepared for?
I think for me, the biggest thing that I wasn't prepared for was the people aspect of it. And, the Army is all around people. It's working with others, managing others. Like, I've heard somewhere like the Army's built on the altar of like its people, and that's its biggest asset, kind of thing. But one thing that I know is like every single person's basic training experience is going to be completely different based on the people you end up going with, the people who are in your company, in your platoon, and then on the cadre side, your company commander can be different. Your cadre is going to be different. Even between cycles, like the way things run is going to be slightly different. And that, I think, can drastically impact how the cycle goes and how your training goes as a whole. And, I was very blessed. My company was really squared away for the most part and really was on top of what they were doing. But, and the hand in hand with that is sometimes, there's people who aren't super motivated to be there or are really difficult to work with. And it takes them a really long time to, get the individual taken out of them and into the whole like team effort mentality. And that was really frustrating. And I feel like that's something you can't really prepare for. It's a thing that you have to experience in the moment and learn how to work through, because a big part of being there is learning how to work with the team and how to be on the team and support the team. And yeah, that was one thing that I really wasn't prepared for, because I mean, there's really no way for one to prepare for it beyond experiencing it, I feel like.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting follow-up question if you have the same type of dynamics with OTS, because I feel like when I went to my officer basic training, like we were all like super motivated and there wasn't anyone who didn't want to be part of the team because we were all in ROTC already and we kind of already knew like the structure, and it was really competitive to get to go there. So it wasn't like everyone who went to MEPS got to go. It was only the people who had gotten selected. And
Yeah.
And so I wonder if the dynamics will be different.
A lot of people in my company and in my battalion as a whole, I think there were 25 in my company of 200 that are going on to OCS with me. And then in my battalion of 1,000, there were 100 of us total that are going on to OCS. So in theory, I know some of the people that I will be going to OCS with. And, hopefully we all end up in the same area doing the same thing, because they're a good group of people that I ended up with at basic. But, we'll have to see. But from what I can tell, I think, like you said, they're motivated to be there, interested, because we were all had to go through the OCS board, the selection process to even get there, with the interviews and the packets and the paperwork and putting the time in to get there. So beyond just going to MEPS, right? So we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, there's still work to be done to enlist. It's just there's a whole extra level of becoming an officer and all the extra ROTC, like all the requirements, or I know how much work it is to do the packets for OTS to be an officer in any of the branches is a lot of work, a lot of paperwork. I just think that'll be interesting to compare the two. Was there anything else that was kind of unexpected?
The cold. I don't know if it was just the time I went, because I'm from the Northeast, so I'm used to it being cold, but I think it's a completely different animal when you're out in the field for a couple of days and it's just freezing cold. There were a couple of nights when we had our field training exercises and it was like a low of 28 and we were just shivering, cuddling up, like, please, just some warmth. And again, that's one of those things that like you just get from experience. So I don't think any of us were prepared for it to be as cold as it was. And they don't want to risk you being a heat cat, so you're not allowed to wear snivel gear because for the South, I was in South Carolina at Fort Jackson, so the days are warm, but then the nights are really cold. And it's just that fluctuation of temperature. It's very hard to get acclimated to right away. But that was only the latter half of like November to December that it was really brutal. But it was cold, and it was unexpectedly cold.
Yeah, it was like really nice in October because I'm in Virginia, and then all of a sudden in November it got cold. And now it's December and it's not that, I mean, it was cold overnight tonight, but it's been really warm randomly, and I'm like, what's going on?
Yeah.
But November, the last 2 weeks in November, it was cold.
Yeah, that last week in November was the final FTX that we had to do, and it was 4 days and 3 nights, and oof.
I think that's one of the things, like when I went to my army training, it was in Indiana, and it was cold, and it was snowy, and I had never been in the snow, and I was like, this snow thing isn't that much fun when you're like out in it for hours and running around doing whatever exercise it is. It's different than like going out and playing in the snow for an hour and then come. It's like, no, you're outside, it's cold, and we got kind of used to it, but we never had to sleep outside. That would not have been fun.
Right.
But it was crazy to be in the cold and the snow and trying to fire a weapon and be it's like snowing while we were trying to fire weapons.
Gosh. Oh goodness.
Yeah, you definitely get to be outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually enjoy being in the field, but dang, we got to work on being in the cold because that was brutal.
That doesn't sound fun. I don't like being cold. I just remember being hot at my boot camp training because it was summer and it was hot and humid.
Yeah, I don't know what's worse. I really don't. Because they both have their perks, but then they have such bad benefit, like cons on the other side of it. Because, I mean, overheating is even just so brutal as well as freezing.
So what would you say was like your biggest takeaway? Did you learn anything about yourself from training or anything like that?
I think for me, I found that throughout training, I was always very worried about not being able to do the task at hand. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was always very nervous about not being able to do it to the standard or missing something, messing up and not doing it right. And I found that, every obstacle that I came up against, I did either, to the standard or with flying colors, right? And I was able to surpass even my own expectations. And I think something that I'm going to try to take away from this is I'm capable of a lot more than I thought I was, and I feel like a lot of us are always a lot more capable than we think we are, in any aspect. So that's something that I'm going to try to carry with me through to OCS in my next phase of my training, is that, you're capable of a lot more than you think you are.
I think that's a really good takeaway. It really resonates because I was so afraid of like everything and like that I wouldn't do good at it that sometimes I didn't like stand up and say I can do that, and then they like would push me to do it, like force you to do it, and then I was like, oh, I could do that, wasn't so bad. And so I think that's a good lesson learned, especially to take that into OTS and to focus on that and like to remember, because that's one of the big things I learned from my deployment was I could do more than I thought. And so whenever I had to do something I didn't want to do, I was like, remember, you could do more than you think. And then it really helped push me.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I feel like as much as you learn about the Army and you learn about, your new job and new skills, it's learning a lot about yourself because, especially we're in an environment where you're cut off completely from your existing support system and you have to rapidly build a new one with your battle buddies there. And then you also have to learn how to really rely on yourself to pick yourself up and square yourself away for the next task because, basic training comes and it just keeps coming until it's done.
Yeah, that's probably like why it pushes you so much because it's just like bam, bam. So I wanted to talk a little bit. You went to training, obviously, in October of 2021, and COVID is still a thing. So what was it like to go through training? Was there certain protocols in place to keep you safe or anything that you can tell people about?
Well, the vaccine is required now for service members. So we're still in this phase where a certain percentage of the incoming population has already been vaccinated or needed the vaccine there. So, in the initial round of inoculation that you get when you're going through reception, some people had to get the COVID vaccine while they were there. Those were the ones who actually had to be tested while we were coming in. If you were vaccinated, you didn't have to get tested. And so the people who were unvaccinated who ended up testing positive, had to go quarantine for 2 weeks and were by that process recycled into another training class. But once we got through reception and started, you spend a lot of time, wearing masks, and they issue you masks. So we were wearing masks and they have a new phase of training. So originally it was red, white, and blue, and now it's yellow, red, white, blue. And through yellow phase, we're wearing masks more frequently, and we are kind of separated by the people you live with. So we were actually in an all-female platoon for the initial couple of weeks of basic training. So we worked out together as the female platoon. We went to the classroom as the female platoon. We weren't allowed in the DFAC either. So we were just eating kind of in the bays, not in the bays, in the breezeways below the building where we do our formations and stuff. It was more like hot A's coming to us rather than us going into the DFAC. They kind of front load a lot of the classroom material. So we learned a lot about, land nav and customs and courtesies and preliminary drill and ceremony as a female platoon. And then once we were cleared through yellow phase, which was either 10 or 14 days later, everyone who was unvaccinated got tested again. And if a certain percentage came back with, positive for COVID, then we had to stay in yellow phase. But if not, we were able to move into red phase, which was the more traditional basic training where our platoons were integrated. So it was male, female again. And then we also didn't have to wear the masks as much because at that point, like, you're living in a bubble. Like, we don't leave, we don't interact with anyone outside of the cadre. And if we do interact with anyone, so say like in the DFAC or like when we have to do motor movement and we're riding the bus, we're always wearing masks. So masks in and out of the DFAC, except when you're eating, and then masks on the bus. But then other than that, we sometimes wear masks like around, or if we go to like issuing, so we had to get more gear, CIF, things like that, then we were wearing masks. But just around like our areas, and if we're doing PT especially, like it was a lot more, normal, I guess, to what it used to be kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting how they have like that yellow phase where you're kind of in quarantine for your beginning of training and they keep you separated from all the other trainings that are already past that. That's really interesting. That's kind of, it makes a lot of sense. I'm like, wow, the Army figured that out.
Yeah, it was weird, but I mean, I guess, gotta make do with what we got until we get it all sorted out. So
yeah, that sounds really interesting. And then you said something about cell phones. So do you call home with your own cell phone?
Yeah, so obviously they take your personal bag and keep it in a storage closet, and they keep your phone in a separate bag in the same closet. And so we had phone calls typically weekly, so every Saturday or Sunday we would get a phone call. And, they dictate how long of a phone call, or if you got it. There were a couple of weeks where they were like, no phone call for you guys because you're terrible. Usually, like, they would have, the PG or NAPG who was, like, in charge of the platoon plugging in the platoon's phones. So we had, like, power cords in the back of the room. We would plug them all in to make sure they were fully charged. And then we would get our phone call or phone time, because you could do whatever you wanted on your phone. You were just given the little chunk of time to do it. So typically weekly, and it was your own phone.
But it wasn't guaranteed.
No, not guaranteed. And it's, again, tying back to what I said earlier, it's company dependent whether or not you get it. Because sometimes we would look over and we would see other companies on their phones. We're like, oh man, like, that sucks.
That's funny. It's so interesting how different technology has, like, changed the way.
Yeah, because I remember talking to some people, especially like my recruiters, and they were like, you get an hour, like, or two, or for whatever amount of time every weekend. Like, we got a, like, collect call on a payphone. This is all you get. Very different.
Yeah, when I went, we put our phones in a bag the day we got there, and then they gave them to us the night before we went home. I mean, my training was only a month long because it was in the summer between my sophomore and junior year. And then they gave it to us the night before to charge, and they were like, do not use your phone until you leave. So it's kind of interesting. Is there any advice that you would give to someone who is preparing to go to basic training or boot camp training? Like, what advice would you give them?
One thing that we kind of talked about it very briefly, but I think is really worth mentioning too, the new Army regulations for hair did not apply in basic training. I was required to wear my hair in a bun the whole time. I think, like, it's worth mentioning because people were like, because I ended up, taking your advice and cutting, a lot of my hair off. So I had very short hair going in, and they were like, oh, you can get away with a ponytail. It's totally fine. And I showed up and they were like, nope, bun all the time. Gelled hair, like, you gotta look put together at all times. And I was like, whoa, okay, sure. We'll figure it out. So that's one thing I would recommend keeping in mind, especially for the Army. But I mean, the things that I mentioned earlier, like really doing the research on what you want to do. And, that's when you're talking to your recruiter and MEPS and the whole process, like knowing what you want out of your experience and then knowing what's coming for basic training for me was huge. And just preparing myself as much as I possibly could so that, a stressful situation doesn't have to be even more stressful,
Yeah. I mean, no one can see me, but when you said that, my mouth about the hair, I was like, what? That's crazy. I had no idea. And that's so important to know because that's like one of the worst parts of going to basic training is having to keep your hair in reg. So, I mean, I understand like the stress, the good order and discipline, but that's really, it's kind of like backwards from like all the research. Anyways, that's not important. We can't argue with the Army. And I'm betting that OTS is going to be the same, that you have to have your hair in regs, or do you know?
I do not know, but I'm going to operate under the assumption that I will have to be in regs all the time. But yeah, I mean, again, it's going to depend on my company and how they want to run things as well. And then, whatever comes down from the battalion even. So we'll see, I guess, when I get there. Yeah, their argument was, you're not a soldier yet, so you don't get the special regulation hair. You gotta wear your hair in a bun. We were like, okay, whatever you say, Drill Sergeant.
That's really interesting. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule so that we could do this interview. And I'm excited to meet up with you again and whenever you finish OTS. And then if you're listening, this will go live back to back. So you won't have to wait the 12 weeks. If you have any other questions about training, just send me an email or find me on social media and I can help answer those. So thank you so much, Allison.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. I really hope that it helped you in your journey to the military. And if you want to learn more about joining the military, please check out my new book, A Girl's Guide to Military Service. And I'll have a link so you can pre-order in the show notes. And I also want to give another shout out to our sponsors for this series, Women Veteran Alliance, J. Volbreck Consulting, Garrett Sorensen with Markham Wealth, photography by Trish Algrea Smith, Serve Like Her, and Nomades Collections. You can learn more about our sponsors at the Girl's Guide to the Military landing page, which I have linked to in the show notes, where you can also find every episode from the series. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll come back next week.